Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. Well, good morning. I am Troy Pano, the president here at the University of Mary Washington. Hopefully most of you know that fact. This is a very exciting day in which we have been waiting for a very long time. I mean that in a variety of ways. Certainly those who have been working diligently for our inaugural Day on Democracy here at University of Mary Washington. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Marina, you and other students, when you were a student here more than 2 years ago, began this effort, working hard with administration and with faculty and staff, really a student-led initiative to convince us that this was an important thing to do. I think we all agreed that it was an important thing to do, but in terms of how to make it work, I really have to give a lot of credit to you, Marina, but also our current student leadership, people like Ashley Lutz, who has chaired the committee, who has planned not only today's events, but all the events that have led up to this election day, our Day on Democracy. Faculty like Professor David Stallman from Psychological Sciences, who has worked diligently on the committee, as well as our Associate Director for the Center for Community Engagement here at the University of Mary Washington, Sarah Deweese, and many, many others who I'm not mentioning, who have worked so hard to really develop a wonderful program all fall semester leading to this very exciting inaugural Day on Democracy. I want to encourage everyone to not only participate in this, but also all the day's events for Day on Democracy. Of course, the first order of business, if you have not voted, please make sure that you take time today to vote. If you have voted, do everything you can to encourage everyone else, your friends and those in the community, to get out and let their voice be heard on this critically important day. This is an important day for me for a variety of reasons, not just because I'm a citizen of this democracy and I know how critically important today is, but also since when I got here, in my 5th year as president, I was charged by the Board of Visitors to articulate a vision for the future of Mary Washington. It was not my vision, it was really a collective vision after listening to this community, the students, the faculty, the staff, in terms of what is important to Mary Washington, what's in our DNA as a public liberal arts mission. And the first pillar of that vision is to promote civic and community engagement, because we think the first and most important thing that we do here is to prepare good citizens who are going to be fully engaged in our communities and in our democracy, not just on election day, but on every other day of the year as well. And that's what excites me so much about this Day on Democracy, because it advances and promotes citizenship in a variety of ways, not just turning up to vote, but all the other things we can do in our communities to fortify our democracy and to fortify those institutions that really undergird our democracy. So with that, it is my honor to have an opportunity to introduce the first panel discussion and our very esteemed guest. Moderator of this panel discussion will be the volunteer coordinator, Petra Aloizos. I hope I said that pretty close to correct. Please correct me if I got it wrong, Petra. And our special guest is Ambassador Derek Mitchell. Ambassador Mitchell was appointed president of the National Democratic Institute in 2018 and brings to the role decades of distinguished experience in diplomacy and foreign policy. From 2012 to 2016, Ambassador Mitchell was the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar, or Burma is what it was previously known as, serving as America's first ambassador to the country in 22 years. Previously, he was Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Asian and Pacific Security Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, including 6 months as Acting Assistant Secretary, where he was responsible for overseeing the Defense Department's security policy in Northeast, Southeast, South, and Central Asia. For his service, he received the Office of the Secretary of Defense Award for Distinguished Public Service in August 2011. Prior to his service in the Obama administration, Ambassador Mitchell was Senior Fellow and Director of the Asia Division of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From 1997 to 2001, he served as Special Assistant for Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he was the principal author of the Department of Defense's 1998 East Asia Strategy Report, Earlier in his career, Ambassador Mitchell spent nearly 4 years at NDI as Senior Program Officer for Asia and the former Soviet Union. He also previously worked as a foreign policy assistant in the office of Senator Edward M. Kennedy from Massachusetts. Ambassador Mitchell has authored numerous books, articles, policy reports, and opinion pieces on international affairs. He received a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, and was a visiting scholar at Peking University in 2007. He also, by the way, speaks Mandarin Chinese proficiently. So with that said, Petra, I turn it to you.
Thank you so much, President Pano, and thank you, Ambassador Mitchell, again for being here with us, here today. For those who aren't familiar, what is NDI and what is it that you do there?
Well, first, let me just thank President Pano for that introduction and congratulate him and everyone at Mary Wash for this day. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I think the idea of including civic mindedness, civic participation is a wonderful thing to do. So congratulations to everybody who's involved in this day, and I'm really honored to be part of it. So thank you for inviting me. National Democratic Institute, it's been around since 1983, since the time of President Ronald Reagan. It was established really to help democracies or new democracies get their start. It is not natural necessarily to know, okay, you have a transition to democracy, people demand to have the vote and such. How do we do this? What goes into it? So we're about sharing experiences from around the world, those who have gone through transitions to democracy, established democracies like the United States, sharing their experiences on building what we call democratic institutions. So think about what goes into a democracy. You need to have political organization. So that could be in the form of political parties that collect people of common interest to run for office and pursue, public policy. You can have people who don't run for office, who just civic organizations, who organize themselves to pursue a particular interest. You also have legislatures that have to do oversight and pass bills. How do parliaments organize themselves? So those institutions, and then you have processes like elections, how to ensure elections are free and fair. And then there's not just those things, but the culture of democracy, which is probably the most important thing, frankly. You can have institutions, you can go through the motions, but if you don't have the culture of how do you communicate, how do you respond, how do you engage with your constituents, how do you know what people are thinking, what is the way that citizens and government interact, and what are the roles and responsibilities there. NDI is about sharing those things, trying to help those institutions get off the ground, those processes work well, and that culture to be ingrained. And it's hard, it's difficult. We have 55 offices around the world. We work in more than 70 countries. Over 35 years, we worked in more than 150 countries. We have about 1,000 people, about 200 in Washington, but 800 around the world. So we're a global organization that helps to promote and support the development of democracy in countries undergoing this transition.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more. I love that term, democracy culture. I know a significant part of NDI is election observation around the world. So you've had a lot of experience in observing all kinds of democracies. And I want to eventually address some of the bigger questions about our context, the American context. But before we begin that, how do we begin assessing a democracy? What demarcates a good democracy from a flawed one or a bad democracy?
Well, the first thing to understand is democracy is always a work in progress. It is never done, and it has to be owned by the citizens of every generation. No democracy is irreversible. No democracy is inevitable. You cannot be complacent. It matters. It depends on all of us as citizens to defend it and protect it. So to say there's a good or perfect, there's no such thing as a perfect democracy. And I'm sure everybody on this call will know that America is not, and certainly has never been, a perfect democracy. We talk about building a more perfect union and a more perfect democracy. But what makes a better democracy than another is one that is responsive, that is inclusive of every citizen equally, that nobody, nobody is left behind. Nobody is seen as lesser, has fewer rights than anyone else. that there are accountability measures put in place, that those accountability measures are strong, anti-corruption or just oversight, that there is some kind of balance of power or separation of powers within government to check on each other, that there is strong citizen engagement, and frankly, civic trust is critical. That's why we're talking about the civic component of what Mary Washington is doing is very important. I think we're seeing this, frankly, in the pandemic environment, which is a test of democracy strength in any country. Do you have that civic trust? Do people trust the institutions? They trust each other. They trust the information. They trust their leaders. That makes for a strong democracy. And frankly, we're always trying to strengthen over time.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a couple, I guess, maybe standards for what makes a good democracy, or the parts that constitutes a good, improving democracy. What should citizens do if those standards aren't necessarily being upheld, if they seem like they're deteriorating or they aren't as strong as they used to be?
Get involved, be part of things. Don't let it happen. If the institutions are fraying, if the rules are not being abided by, make sure, I mean, frankly, being a citizen is not just a right, it's a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a job. It is a job to be a citizen. It is hard when people are trying to make ends meet and younger people trying to make their way and get through college or get their job, get their first jobs, and other people who may not have much and they have to have multiple jobs to raise their families. It's tough, but it requires that kind of engagement and responsibility to seek information, to seek correct information, to understand what is incorrect or false information, and to hold the leaders accountable for that by voting. You must vote, or to get involved in civic action, if need be, to demand that your voice should be heard, to call your congressman or senator, or congresswoman, I should say, representative or senator, and make sure that person knows how you feel and that you will not tolerate breaking of rules, breaking of norms, and institutions falling apart, because ultimately it's going to be up to us to determine what the leaders can or cannot get away with, because politicians often will try and do whatever they can to get reelected. I'm not saying all politicians are bad. I'm just saying the incentive structure will be they'll listen to who is loudest, who will vote, their voters matter, who gives them money, which is also a voice. So you have to find a way to balance that with other voices.
Absolutely. And I think everyone in this call would also agree that civic activism and keeping governments accountable is really important. Unfortunately, I feel like an experience that either we've all experienced ourselves or we've seen people in our lives experience is this sort of waking up to maybe in America that isn't what they thought, that some of these principles seem deteriorated, but it has sort of come out of nowhere. So I think that the question we've all been asking and then trying to answer ourselves is, how did we get here? What factors do you see as being responsible for what many are describing as an erosion of American democratic principles and norms?
There are many things I think that have gotten us to our place today. First of all, do not lose hope and do not lose confidence that the great thing about democracy and the great thing about the United States, for all its flaws and for all the steps forward and back, is that we do self-correct. We have gone to dark places and pulled back. And it's because people of principle decided this was not acceptable and we're going to fight. And this is the fight of our generation, your generation, and certainly mine, even though I'm older. We all have that responsibility, and this is the moment where we have to fight for our democracy. How do we get here? I think it's been a steady erosion, frankly. It's not something that happens all of a sudden. It's not based on a single individual. Democracy's decline is never meant based on a single leader. So we can't put it all on a single leader, even though leadership absolutely matters. And the fact we don't have principled leadership, I think, certainly helps for the decline of democracy. But it's also because people have been complacent, I think. Young people have never, and I was one of these, younger people never have asserted their power through their vote as strongly as they could in the past. And that's allowed other generations and with other interests to vote in greater numbers. Older people vote in greater numbers. that has played a role. I think, frankly, that just the structural problems of economics, the economic problems in our country, the divisions economically, where people have felt, folks like myself who have lived in Washington for a while, I'm from Connecticut. I don't feel like I'm a swamp or I'm of Washington or I'm the elite, but I look at myself and such, and I look how I'm dressed and all the rest, and I'm a white male. I am elite. I am privileged. And waking up to that privilege, waking up to that, I've always been trying to be mindful of broader issues in the country, but being much more mindful day to day of the fact that there are white males and white people in the country who are also underprivileged. Not, they're still privileged, but they're underprivileged compared to myself, who economically have fallen behind, and they feel like we're not speaking for them. And that certainly goes for Black Americans and Hispanic Americans and all the rest. So understanding that the economic deprivation that has occurred in this country, and that has created mistrust and aggravation, alienation from the elite who are in the cities, that we see that all over the world. NDI sees that everywhere. We see that in Poland, we see that in Hungary, we see that, the rural-urban divide, the economic divides between those who are globalized and those who are left behind in other parts of the country. That has let people feel frustrated by the two political parties. They're not answering to the needs, and therefore they look for something different. They look for change. The original change may have been Barack Obama, and then they said, well, we're going to go for this something else, and it can be very detrimental to the health of a democracy. So we need to be more responsive in the United States, in the center. I think there's a recognition of that, but we need to be creating a different type of system so that those voices can be heard and felt and dealt with very assertively, so people feel that if they're going to work hard, that they have fairness, that there's equity.
Mm-hmm.
Without that, people will give up.
Absolutely. What do governments need to do to build citizen trust? I guess to invite inclusivity and to invite unity. What do institutions need to do to build civic trust over time? And this is something that you've had experience as well. When you started your position as ambassador, you were working for a country that hadn't had any U.S. diplomatic presence for 22 years. How do you begin building trust in a place where there seems to be none?
Well, first is to recognize we have this problem, not be complacent about it, be mindful about it. And look, I used to say that democracy is not just the right to speak, it's the responsibility to listen. And I said that when I was in Burma, in Myanmar, when people after 50 years weren't able to speak. They were repressed. And then after 50 years, everyone was speaking, but no one was listening to each other. And that's also the problem in the United States. We have to listen. And we in Washington, we everywhere, whoever we are, we need to be spending more time listening to each other and understanding each other. It's the basis for diplomacy. And it's the basis for civic trust and understanding. And I love maybe you all know this, but I've heard this from others, but a mentor of mine in town here used to say openly, he'd say, look, he would say, my mom used to say, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use those in that proportion. Listen twice as much as you speak. And I like that. And I spent, when I first started NDI, I spent mostly a listening tour, understanding how people felt in the organization. I try to do that as an ambassador. We need to do that more in the United States, to listen to each other. And even if you feel you are deprived or you are underprivileged, you are not being heard, you absolutely should speak up, but also listen to others as well. And understand why others feel the way they do, hear where they are, talk, give people a sense that you understand them. When you do that, the walls come down. It's remarkable. The best thing I used to hear when I was a diplomat, and I'd love to hear it when I was in Burma, when they would be telling me something and they would stop and they would say, oh, but you know us, Mr. Ambassador, you know us. I know, I've listened to you, understand us. So when you get to a point where someone feels like that other side understands you, or you understand them, they will listen more to you. And that conversation is what democracy is about. It's not about everybody thinking the same. We're not going to think the same. We're a diverse country, and frankly, we're going to be stronger through that diversity of experience. We're not going to convince everybody of this. But if people can have that respect and trust that we're speaking honestly, And the only way that really happens, in my view, is in some ways not really this, though this is the best replacement we have to it today because of the pandemic. It's not through a screen. It has to be face-to-face. We need to do much more face-to-face interaction. If we can't be face-to-face, this is fine. It should be less of lecturing like what I'm doing to you, but more listening. This is what this forum is about, and I get that. But Facebook and the social media is not about listening. This is what I'm concerned about. It's much more about talking, finding communities of simply commonality, of reaffirming your view, which is fine to find communities of common interest and to organize yourselves. But don't keep to that. You must get out of that bubble, understand that there is another point of view. They come to it with their own experience. And unless you understand that experience and listen and feel it and engage that somehow, we're going to continue in our silos, and we're not going to have a strong democracy. We're just going to have tribes going at each other.
That's an excellent response. And I think that brings up another great question, which is how do we begin listening to each other? I think for a lot of people, it's very easy to be able to engage in discourse with people that we anticipate having similar views. But it's much harder when we anticipate confrontation or we anticipate disagreements. And I think that's especially present, the closer we get to elections, there is this sort of tension in our social circles to avoid discussions we think might end in difficulties. How do we on an individual level begin to bridge differences that potentially could be hostile, and how do we diffuse that hostility?
Right. Well, it means being patient. It means being open-minded. It means being understanding. It means being empathetic. These are all the things. Without this, you have war. Really. And that could be war between countries. It could be war between the states, or war between communities, or war between the sexes or the races, or whatever it is that has occurred. War between tribes, as I say. If we truly want a democracy, we have to recognize there will be diverse perspectives, and people will say things we don't like. There are obviously lines beyond which you have civic discourse. We should not accept that. But we have to find ways to build those bridges, and it's going to be hard. There are some people that will simply be blocked off. There are some people who won't accept others, or won't accept facts, which will be very frustrating, or have what they say alternative facts, or will say whatever you say is different is fake news, or whatever else. We have to continue to find where there might be fissures or openings, not fissures, but sort of openings where we can get through. But it is hard. I mean, it is very hard. And the most important thing in a democracy is that we have a common understanding of facts and information. The information is not solid and not strong, and people can't distinguish between facts and lies or disinformation. Well, frankly, we are in trouble. I mean, I'll just be very honest, we are in trouble, because democracy requires that you have responsible citizens who can understand at least facts and can debate those facts, maybe, or debate ideas, or debate how to deal with them. But we're going to have to deal with some of these structural issues that go beyond our ability to come together. And that's what NDI has been thinking about, and we need to be thinking about the role of technology and technology companies, in digital literacy, and media, and just our responsibilities as citizens to do in this regard.
So as far as being able to maintain a system that ensures that information is accurate, or at least that as a society and a culture that we respect accurate information, do you see that being more of an issue for individuals, or is there an institutional aspect? Should governments and institutions also take a role in being able to combat misinformation?
Yes, I mean, this is a huge challenge, and you raise, I think everybody has a responsibility. I think the companies have a huge responsibility to be to determine what the norms and rules are on their platforms. It can't just be a free-for-all. You can't, and some of these, as you know, Facebook has algorithms that encourage people to have more extreme views, or to have their views reaffirmed rather than have conversation. And Mark Zuckerberg will talk about the right of free speech. He gave a speech at Georgetown. I was actually in the hall when he gave the speech at Georgetown about free speech, and wrapped himself in the cloak of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and other American greats. who talked about free speech, and it's absolutely critical to have free speech and free media. But again, it's about the responsibility to listen and engage in communication and dialogue. And his platform is not about that. So they have a responsibility. Governments do have to think about where the line between free speech and hate speech or irresponsible activity, like deep fakes and disinformation. There are lines there, but we don't want to be China. We don't want to control information either and have a state-sponsored information flow. So there's a line there between the free speech and irresponsible, sort of almost criminal speech or undemocratic speech. So that's what we have to figure out, where that line is. Governments have a responsibility. We as citizens have a responsibility. These companies have responsibility. And we need to have a dialogue about all that, and then work that with our other democratic partners around the world, because China and other illiberal actors are out there trying to shape norms that are controlling, state control of all of this. And they will say, we can't see what happens when you have free speech, you have chaos. And they're trying to, Russia and others are trying to sow that chaos so they can undermine democracy and say, see, democracy doesn't work, you need state control. And down that road leads to very illiberal problems. You have Orwellian state security surveillance systems is the other extreme, but a very real danger if we don't get ourselves, get our act together.
Could you actually maybe provide an example of some time in your professional experience when you've been able to diffuse maybe a potentially hostile or high tension situation through political discourse or productive discourse?
It's hard to say one. I mean, it's really about all that I did in Burma in a way. I mean, it is about listening. If you think of, our relationship with Burma, with Myanmar, in those days was very fraught. We had basically isolated them. We had sanctions on them, trade sanctions and investment sanctions. They didn't trust America at all. They didn't trust me at all necessarily when I arrived as a first ambassador. Actually, I was envoy first. Before I was ambassador, I was a special envoy because we just didn't want to recognize this military regime. It meant having a lot of conversations and explaining to them we did not wish them ill. We actually wished them well, but we could not accept that they were oppressing their people, that they didn't allow free speech, did not allow the opposition leader, who was a democracy leader of the country, Aung San Suu Kyi, who today is maybe viewed a little bit different than she did then, but she was the leader, really the hero of the country. They had her under house arrest and didn't allow her to run for office. And we said, we just can't contribute to that. We had a very honest conversation about it. And by listening and understanding their perspectives, I was able to figure out a diplomatic strategy to talk in their terms. If you want national unity, if you want security, if you want all these things, you want to be a strong country, you want to be a developed country, all these things they wanted, this path you're on is not going to work for you. You need these other things. You need democracy for these reasons. So by using their own terms and listening to them, I was able to diffuse that relationship, build a very constructive relationship, and get them to make reforms. And I have it from them that it made a difference, that there was someone there who was listening. I also try to diffuse, many of you may know about the Rohingya question in Rakhine State, the genocide that happened there after I left. And I tried many times of bringing those communities together, and I actually had opportunity as I left to quiet conversations. And we saw, particularly because of women, I may say, it was the women in the Rakhine communities that were reaching out to the Muslim communities of building these ties through engagement, slow engagement. But that didn't work out the way we hoped, but it was actually a way of, it's just basic diplomacy, listening, engaging, hearing them out, talking on their terms, and showing good faith.
And I think as well, it's really important, and we were saying earlier, for citizens and individuals to, and I guess in a way, make governments listen, to speak up, to step forward, to make themselves known so that governments can be responsive. Unfortunately, a pretty widespread trend today in American politics, especially among the youth, is that a lot of people are sort of jaded by the political process. And I'm sure that's an experience that you observed in Burma from the citizenry as well, who were probably jaded by their governments and their institutions. How do you begin convincing populations across the board to begin stepping their foot forward and to make themselves heard?
Well, first thing is vote. The politicians will respond to their constituency. They want to gain re-election. And if the young people as a mass say, this is what we want, we're going to vote, we're a bigger block than say the senior vote, or my age, I'm 56 and others will be even older than I, but we end up voting. But young people don't, they'll dismiss the young people's voice, and they'll listen some, but they'll say, well, you may not vote, or you're too young, or whatever else to understand. And they'll look at other constituencies. So vote, get engaged. Abraham Lincoln had a great line. He said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And that's the great thing in a democracy. If you have the chance, we have that chance in the United States. As the problem of the institutions fraying is because the civic participation has frayed. I think people don't understand, or the civic education has frayed. The places, in Florida, the Parkland students in Florida, the reason why people don't understand, maybe some of you know, but the Parkland students being so civically engaged is not an accident. They, in Florida, had a requirement in their high schools for civic education and civic activism. They demanded it. It was a requirement in their schools. So when it came to the point where there was this tragedy at Parkland High School, they stepped up. And it wasn't because they were extraordinary individuals, though they were. They also were educated and had already experienced and exercised. Mm-hmm. It's very important to get engaged. It is absolutely essential, and to shape the future. And to think, even if you're not a politician, there's a lot you can do. If you're not in an NGO, you still can be engaged locally and vote, and get your neighbors and your family to do the same, and then control this democracy, because you will eventually control this democracy, and keep fighting, because there are always going to be people that want to control you and don't want to follow the popular will. There's obviously systemic problems in the United States we need to get on top of, and I hope that happens in coming years. Issues of voter suppression, or whether it's active voter suppression, or rules and laws that in effect suppress people's vote or make it more difficult for people to vote. That means you have to vote locally, not just nationally. Vote locally for your state legislatures, for your governors. And Democrats have done a terrible job at that. But that's where the elections are done locally. Other countries around the world have a national election commission. We have it done by the state and by localities. So get involved locally and shape how it's done. And you'll find in 10 years, this will be a very different country than we've seen it today.
Mm-hmm. And most, I would say, a lot of students at UMW have voted for the first time, or are going to vote for the first time today. And nationwide, we've seen record youth turnout in a number of states. But something that we say at Dan Democracy a lot is that citizen activism begins with the vote, but it doesn't end there. You have to choose democracy every day. What does it look like for individuals to choose democracy every day? Or how do you choose democracy every day?
First of all, isn't voting great? I don't know how people felt. I'm 56. Two things I love. One, my wife went and early voted in DC. And DC is not going to matter. It's the difference between 93% Democratic or 94% Democratic. Mm-hmm. But still, I felt so good. We were so energized, and I feel wonderful every time I vote. Nothing I love more than election day and watching people vote. The actual act of watching people stand and vote, and the dignity and the affirmation of human dignity that is democracy, that is voting. The worth of every individual and every individual voice is life affirming. I love it. And anybody who wants to, getting involved in that is inspiring. So as you think about it, not just voting, but getting involved in the vote, or getting involved in talking to people, certainly around elections is important. but even on election day and beyond. I used to say the same thing in Burma, that people's voice doesn't stop on election day. Democracy doesn't end on election day. We can, if you're not even involved civically, just engaging with people in conversation. Living democracy means being a citizen, an active, engaged, responsible citizen. Listen, read, watch, talk to people, debate as you need to, be open-minded to people. If we are modeling that, if there's a whole generation modeling that kind of thing, even if you feel hurt by what someone says, to allow it because, or if they're saying something wrong, if they say a word wrong, or they say something that feels like, we talk about microaggressions, feel that hurt. I'm not saying not to feel that hurt. Figure out how to change that constructively. How can we get through to someone in a way that understands that maybe they didn't get it, they didn't understand, that they may be defensive if they're aggressed as well back, and try to open the way for a conversation. Always think about what can I do to open the way for a conversation and bring them forward. We all will feel defensive. We all will feel angry. We all will feel hurt. Frankly, I less than most, being a white male, I understand that. And I don't know who's listening here. I don't know the demographics or but I understand that I have a particular responsibility as a white male to do more and to be mindful of this. Those who are privileged in this country need to be mindful of this and do our part more than the rest. But everybody, I would ask, every individual. I think it's, I don't know how to put this, but we should not think, even if we are victims, try and think of ourselves as how do we be constructive in getting out of that and bringing the country together. And it's hard. There's a lot, the United States is divided deeply now. And it has been encouraged, that division, that leadership matters. So if we find that we have a new day come, then let's see that as a moment for a positive energy, make the moment of that wave and that momentum, and see if we can, and what we've seen over the past year, what we've seen in the streets, what we've seen with Black Lives Matter, what we've seen of all of this, gives me frankly more hope. And let's figure out if we can just say, okay, we haven't done it to date. We are a flawed democracy. Let's be better tomorrow.
Yeah, I love what you said as well about, stepping forward with positive energy and thinking about the future and thinking in terms of our capabilities and our potential. I think for a lot of people right now, that's really difficult to do. And I think it's something we're all equally sort of struggling with. How are we coping in a time where it seems as though hope is the most diminished? How do you unwind after maybe receiving news that is not ideal, or anything that seems to threaten your ability to perceive a positive future?
Yeah. Well, one thing I should say is the folks who are on the bad side, I should say, the dividers, those who are they want us to feel despair. Despair means they win. And that's what they want. They want to beat you down, make you feel powerless, and make you feel you can't make a difference, or that the other side is just going to win, and therefore you kind of lay down. And every time I get frustrated and furious and angry, I remember that. That's what they want me to feel. That's where they want me to feel. And I'm not going to let them. I will be angry. I will not be powerless. I will refuse to lay down and let them beat me. Now, when it comes to events that occur, you have to find a way to disconnect. Think about what I can do, what you can control, what you can't. And I think there's some things you simply cannot control that happen in the world. Think about what you can. Again, acting locally, thinking globally. Act as you can. I mean, luckily, I work for an organization. We can make a difference, I feel. But even my team, I think, gets down. We're a lot of people in the United States, based in DC. They're Americans, and they will think, how can I be involved in democracy overseas when our democracy at home is going to hell? So my job is to pick them up and try to say, look, we have a job to do. It's a hard job, but find a way to get away from this. The pandemic creates enormous stress. The the killing of Black men and Black people we've seen, the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd murder was just debilitating and demoralizing to see. But we have to find a way find a way, I watch sports, I walk my dog, I try and read things that are inspiring, read about history, and think about what can I do with friends to mobilize. And when you mobilize and when you vote and when you get active, you feel more empowered. It's not going to solve anything overnight, but the alternative is despair. The alternative is to give up, and that's not an option. So if that's not an option, think about what we can do. This kind of thing is great, and anything that we can do, getting engaged. I think networking. As mentioned in my bio, I went to the University of Virginia. I went to UVA. I don't know how UVA is viewed among Mary Washington. In my day, Mary Washington was a women's school. Maybe it was just becoming a co-ed, but network among universities. I'd love for Day of Democracy to be election day, but also there's International Day of Democracy in September, which I would love. My vision for this, and I've talked about this, is having and using youth basically, as a centerpiece in the United States, getting universities to network and talk about what does democracy mean to you, to get engaged, to link up with youth overseas. You want to be inspired? Talk to young people overseas. If you want to realize, you talked about Burma and how they must have been jaded. They weren't jaded necessarily. Around elections, certainly after elections, they were excited. They were thrilled. They came out in droves. And young people in particular, you look around the world, where people see democracy as declining, and there's all these problems with democracy, and the authoritarians are having their way. But yet you're seeing demonstrations all over the world, demanding in Hong Kong, in Moscow, in Chile, and you name a country, in Nicaragua, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Lebanon, and I'm just going through the list. It's everywhere. In Belarus. There are two things that make up what these demonstrations are about. It's young people. Young people are driving this. They're saying, we don't accept this. We want something different. We want our voice heard. Thailand is another one recently going on. The second is women. There are women engaged that are driving a lot of this change. When you talk about inclusive, how important inclusivity is, it's essential that if there's going to be a change in this country, it's going to be based on women. And it's going to be, and if our democracy is going to survive this moment, it's going to be women, young people, women of color who've done it. And these are the people who don't look like me, but who look, they will have been disadvantaged in our democracy, but have stepped up to say, listen to us, and they will be the difference whether this country succeeds or not. And it's ironic because we have done poor by them in our history, these communities, and yet their belief in democracy to me is inspiring. And if you talk to people overseas, they'll be inspired by that here. And what we do here, if anything can inspire us here, what we do is a model for others. If we take back our democracy and we show strength here, you will inspire the world. And you'll see change overseas. It'll be mutually reinforcing. So you may think you're disempowered, but what you do today and what you do going forward, you'll be surprised. It will inspire. We use that at NDI to inspire others around the world. It's led to what was the democratic wave around the world. And the regression, frankly, is a reflection, I think, of a lot of the problems here at home in the United States. So you can make a difference.
I think that's an excellent commentary as well on this idea that, the youth and the citizenry in general tend to be very responsive when they are given the space and the opportunity to vote and the opportunity to let themselves be known. You mentioned that historically we haven't treated everyone great. And there's a lot of talk in academia that some aspects of American democracy might be a little outdated or archaic. What do you think are some of the things we can learn from newer democracies, from these new movements that we're seeing around the world?
One thing is be engaged. And newer democracies are, there are different gradations of new democracies. And there certainly are democracies that, like us, are getting frustrated. Their expectations weren't met. And they're starting to get, as I say, frustrated. But there's an energy out there, passion. They don't have an electoral college. that kind of thing, which is archaic, I think. We certainly have to think about, reinvigorating our rules and our laws. Whether it's about the gerrymandering laws and all these things that are suppressing the vote, we have to look at. We can learn. I mean, we have the election. I don't know what we do about the electoral commission issue of it being state by state, whether we can have a national election commission, but some kind of standard nationally. We have to look at that. I think there should be a commission looking at these types of reforms. Also, what's interesting in Taiwan, this is something we absolutely can learn back here. There's something called the civic tech community. We're seeing that in Ukraine. We're seeing it in Estonia. We're seeing it in North Macedonia. A lot of places around the world, young people are figuring out how to use technology to safeguard democracy. They're doing rapid response to disinformation. They're doing digital literacy. They're organizing themselves in volunteer ways of how can we make digital work for democracy, to do civic education, voter education, to do during a pandemic, how to get good information out, how to do contact tracing. Younger people, certainly more than my generation, you all are tech savvy and tech minded. How do you steer tech to be more civic minded, to be more democracy friendly, to engage in conversation? We have something called Design for Democracy initiative. We bring together the civic groups around the world and link them up to the civic companies, the technology companies, to ensure they design their new technologies to assist democracy. How do we can learn from others overseas by organizing ourselves here at home to do that kind of work.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Just looking at the time, I think maybe we can go ahead and move on to audience questions if there are any. I think if anyone in the audience has a question they would like to ask, they can just sort of put it in the chat. Ambassador Mitchell, I don't know if you can see the chat on your screen.
I can, yeah. I see that President Paino was given the floor. It's the last thing. That was a while back. It's time for people to put things in there. Maybe one quick question, and then we could look at the questions here. If you have another question.
Yeah, if there are no questions, I do have a sort of special ending surprise. So we have our rapid fire round. I'm just gonna ask sort of a series of questions. You have maybe 15, 20 seconds to answer, and we'll close with that. But yeah, lightning round. But one last chance if there are any audience questions.
I'm trying to think if there's anything I didn't say. Maybe you'll ask about it later. But I think the thing, as I say, you can be inspired by looking internationally. There's a lot going on out there of people mobilizing, organizing. And I would love to link up universities and young people in the United States to what's happening overseas. I think you learn a lot, as you say, from new democracies. And here we go. What role do we think democracy promotion organization plays in responding to climate crisis? That's a great question. And in fact, NDI, we have a working group looking at climate, precisely because we have to look at all these. We have a new division dedicated to tech, and we're going to look at climate. I think it goes to, I think we absolutely have a role. I think governance is the biggest challenge on climate and the issues of migrants. The climate is going to cause climate migrants, and how do we empower and listen to them and make sure that they stay within the political frame. But I think we can just heighten. We need to ensure that the conversations that need to be had on climate, particularly among young people, because young people are most energized by that issue. That could be a great vehicle to get people engaged civically and to be energized internationally and to show the power of one's voice, and not just in a civic way, but to push their governments in the right direction. In Africa, for instance, which is it 70% under 35, 75% under 35? The median age is 20, median age of people in Africa. And I think much of the developing world is 25. And the median age of their leadership is about 70. So that age gap is essential. And climate, I think climate is a great way to mobilize and to think about how to organize politically to address some of the challenges that we're seeing on migrant or on economic or on other issues that are between states and within states that are going to challenge governance and stability within countries. So we're definitely thinking about that. How would I reform the electoral college problem that allows minority rule and causes about 80% of votes to not even matter during a presidential election? Yeah, well, how would I do it versus what's likely? We have to consider a new system that takes into account the majority of voters in the country. So we just do. You know, my idea, which I've never heard before, I don't know if it makes sense, but we have some kind of bonus for winning the popular vote. So you have the electoral vote, you know, but you get 50 bonus electoral votes, you know, like super delegates. You know, they have a primary system in the Democratic Party. So if you win the electoral vote, you get the popular vote, you get 50 electoral votes. So at least there is a benefit to that, and people, you know, candidates don't ignore California or ignore cities or ignore New York or any of us who are living in urban environments. You know, people in the United States, you know, a lot of times Republicans, particularly conservatives, will talk about real America, the real America out there. Well, they're real America, yeah, in rural environments, but so are people in cities. You know, we're real America. I came from Connecticut, and it was from a small town. My mom still lives in the quote starter house, a tiny house, you know, in Connecticut. And you know, in Connecticut doesn't even matter their vote because they're reliably blue, and that's not fair. That's not fair. So we do have to think about something that is not the current system if we're going to be fair to all voters, the real America that lives all over the country. And I don't really have a perfect answer for that. I do think we do have to keep some version of that in order for us not to ignore the smaller states. But they shouldn't be able to determine, it shouldn't come down to the same 3 states or 4 states in every election. That's just not healthy, and it's a bad model for others around the world.
I think that's actually an excellent transition into our lightning round, because the first question I have for that, as long as there aren't any more audience questions, but the first question I have for the lightning round is, if you were inaugurated as our president in January, what is the first thing you would do? What would be your first reform for our democracy?
There is apparently the House of Representatives had passed, it's HR 1 or something, or whatever it is, that Nancy Pelosi, which is voting reform or electoral reform and democratic reform. I would absolutely look at that. There's so many, when it comes to democracy, that's the most, there's so many things, but democracy, there is legislation now. And I would establish a commission to look at democratic reform. I would ensure that early on, I'm sorry, it's lightning round, so I shouldn't go on too long. That's it. And there'll be, I know that if it's Joe Biden, he has a plan on giving a speech on this type of thing, but I think giving a speech very early on democracy and making this a priority for his 4 years.
What's the best piece of advice that you've ever received for conducting diplomatic work?
Listen.
Let me see, what's something cool that you learned in ambassador school, in the Fletcher School?
There is no ambassador school. No such thing. I had no, if you look at my bio, I was not a diplomat. I mean, I was an Asianist. So we can go into all of that. But what I learned at the Fletcher School, did you say the most important thing at Fletcher?
Or just something cool, something maybe like the most interesting thing you learned that you wouldn't have had you not attended.
Yeah, Fletcher? Well, Fletcher is just graduate school for international relations. That's all Fletcher is. And being an ambassador was never remotely in my mind. It's a complete, never expected that. But Fletcher, I don't know what I learned. I learned so much. International law is, I think, the most fascinating thing for me. Because it's just understanding how, in world history and how much you can learn about how the world works through international law.
When did you know you wanted to be an ambassador?
No, I didn't. I was appointed because I was an expert in Asia, and I had made change as envoy in Burma, and it seemed logical for me to be a politically appointed ambassador. Never, if you would have told me when I was at UVA or 10 years or 20 years that I would be an ambassador, I would never have expected it. So we haven't gone into that. That's more than a lightning round, but I never ever expected I'd ever be an ambassador, which is lessons learned for everybody here, that you never know where your life will take you. Have ambitions, have an idea, but be flexible in your career. Just do things you enjoy that take you in a different path, and you never know where you'll end up.
What makes you hopeful for the future of democracy, both at home and abroad?
Young people, and the energy that's out there. That I'm inspired by the resilience of people around the world who will always want a voice. I mean, democracy is practical. It is not an ideology. It is basically about people's voice, about accountable government, inclusive government, and transparent government, representative government. And people will demand that. People just will, otherwise you'll get corruption, you'll get oppression, and people will never stand for it. And we're seeing that all over the world. We're seeing that in the United States. What inspires me is that energy will always be there. It is human. All we need to do is have the will and not lose hope and lose faith.
Okay, and so for the last question, I have a fill in the blank. Democracy is?
Hope. Democracy is dignity.
Excellent. That was a lovely answer. Well, that's, I think, our time. So thank you again, Ambassador Mitchell, so much for being here with us today, and for having this conversation with me. I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone else in our call learned as well. And I wish you the best for Election Day and going forward with all of your projects.
Those were wonderful questions. Thank you so much for moderating this, and everybody out there, and to the President Payno, thank you so much for this day. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I hope it spreads. I hope next year, maybe on International Democracy Day, you can do something with universities and colleges, not just all over Virginia, but all over the country. If you need assistance in thinking about that, I'm certainly willing to do it, because I've been in touch with many different universities. Congratulations on this initiative. Everyone go vote. Do not lose hope. Please get inspired where you can, where you get knocked down, get back up, and walk, find a dog, find a sporting event, find a book, find a friend, find a community, and keep going. But thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.